This is View from the North with Dr. Ken Rogers, a retired Canadian businessman who has graduate degrees in business and finance and who can help us understand things like the sanctions and whether they are working and to what extent they are working. It's a very interesting subject. We haven't thought about it lately, but we should think about it now. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hello, Jay.
Now let's talk about what they were intended to do, and what the concept was or would have been, historically, when the Ukraine war, when the Ukraine invasion first started. The United States led on that and suggested sanctions to others. But what was in Joe Biden's mind? What did he think would be useful at the time, and what did he implement?
Well, the first idea about sanctions is to coerce somebody into doing something differently than to change their behavior. And so, that is the general or overall objective of sanctions. So, in the case of the invasion of Ukraine, really the bottom line objective is to have Russia change their mind and pack up their bags and go home. Now, obviously, that has not been accomplished. Well, then a secondary objective would be to reduce the effectiveness of their military. Well, if you think of the sanctions as they applied to a large number of the Russian oligarchs, where the TV cameras were enjoying seizures of some Russian oligarchs, luxurious yacht in various ports around the world. Well, if those oligarchs had meaningful power, they could cause changes in, the basic Russian regime, even. Now clearly, none of the Russian oligarchs, joined the riot over the weekend to to try to oust Putin so they could get their yacht back. However, you get that kind of pressure. The other side is economic. Well, if you think of the economic pressure that historical sanctions that have had years to show what they can do or not do. The U.S. sanctions against Cuba and Venezuela, have had the effect of basically ruining the economies of those two nations. Venezuela, the economic effect included ridiculous amount of inflation, aside from increasing poverty and problems, but the overall objective of those sanctions was just not accomplished. That is, there was no regime change in Cuba, nor did they change their attitude. And over time, when you put all of those trade sanctions in, you cause the country to rearrange its affairs. For example, in the Russian sanctions, Russia immediately changed the direction of all their oil and gas exports to the east, like go to India or China or North Vietnam instead of the pipeline to Germany or to Eastern Europe. And so in the long run, Russia will be better off with that, and will not be subject to sanctions. They made new friends rather than, that think like they do, rather than the purpose of the sanction cause a change in the way somebody thinks.
Well, there are three kinds, as I understand it. The first kind is, as you pointed out, the economic sanctions. Another kind are the passport sanctions, and I guess the third kind are the individual sanctions against oligarchs and the like. So what we have is an effort to use all three. And my understanding is that there are roughly 1,000 oligarchs who have been sanctioned. We have 1,000 companies that have been sanctioned, including banks and all that. And we have economic sanctions, as you mentioned, in terms of oil and gas, and and passports. People can't come to the United States. They can't, and for some people, they can't even leave Russia. Like, for example, Putin himself. He's been the subject of an arrest warrant by the International Court of Criminal Justice, and he can't really go anywhere to a signatory to the Rome Agreement for fear of being arrested. So all these things kind of impinge on the ability of the country to do trade, to expand its borders, um, and to do business as it did before. But I certainly agree, and we ought to spend some time on how each of these things has been thwarted in one way or another by Putin. He's a clever fellow, and he clearly has thwarted the oil and gas sanctions, even though the U.S. and Canada and the U.K. Have and Germany have taken at least some steps not to buy Russian oil and to stop the sale of Russian oil. But as you say, he's selling to other people, and it hasn't really stopped him. It hasn't had any significant effect on Russia that we have an oil embargo.
Well, I think there's been a pretty meaningful effect on Russia. The sanctions, if you think of economic sanctions, you really need to kind of break them into two parts. One has to do with product flows, specific restrictions on certain kinds of products, like technological things to help their war effort. Now, the other is capital flows, and capital flows or monetary restrictions are important. For example, the majority of the world's banks have been using a system called the SWIFT system. It started in Europe and it's centered in Belgium. And so when you have the United States and the EU agreeing on some kind of sanction, well, one of the first things done against Russia was to exclude the Russian banks from using the SWIFT system. Now that's the system where, if you go to your local bank in New York City, you go to Morgan Stanley, and there you have a transaction in some other country. That SWIFT system is used from the bank in your country to the bank to almost any bank in any other country. And they have these phenomenal secured communications, which enable the transferring of major amounts of capital or transactions. The SWIFT system doesn't actually move money, but it does the communication that's necessary to make everything work smoothly. And so it was, cutting off that, disrupted the certainly for quite a while, transactions that Russia was trying to do with any country in the world. Similarly, you've got the trade embargoes or trade limitations. The one that's most evident in terms of the effect over time is dealing with Cuba, where the U.S. basically, it's like an absolute blockade that nothing could go in or out of Cuba that the U.S. didn't say was okay. I mean, Cuba has been totally ruined, but the effect of that is when the United States says to other countries, that are dealing with the U.S., if you send your oil to Cuba, we're not going to allow any of your ships or any of your product to come in the US, blah, blah, blah. Well, then, so you force the Cubans to look for a friend that can give them a product they need, such as oil, so they turn to Venezuela. And that creates a connection that is then detrimental to the US interest. So over the years, the US sanctions against Cuba have evolved, and one of the latest excuses for, continuing sanctions against Cuba was because they became friendly with Venezuela. And it's not unlike the situation with Russia, where their oil and gas exports have turned to export to, India, Pakistan, China, countries in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, that was inherent in my thought a minute ago, namely that Putin has beat off the oil and gas sanctions by doing that, and that if you break this down, oil and gas, and then products and dual use products and passports and doing business through banking systems and all that, is like separate categories. The category of oil and gas, I don't think has been too successful. And the question is, what's the biggest ones? What's the ones that hurt most? Because some of them, selling McDonald burgers in Moscow may not be all that big, but it can't be that big. But we have pulled McDonald's out of Russia, and a number of other American brands are not doing business in Russia anymore. I don't think that's a big problem for Putin, because Putin, as a matter of strategy, has tried to replace those American imports with Russian imports. As a matter of fact, he's trying to make Russia self-reliant in a number of areas. He's in a kind of tit for tat move. He has limited exports of Russian products out to the West. So all in all, I mean, it's what you say. They find a way around it. They in fact may come out stronger in some ways. I'm not sure that the goods category is all that effective either. I mean, there's a story about trucks. So we send trucks to somewhere in Europe, and the trucks wind up in Belarus, and then from Belarus they go to Russia, and in Russia they're used for the war. It's exactly what we don't want, but it's hard to crack the trucks. And there's a lot of other dual use type of goods that are getting into countries that may be friendly to us. And from there, from those countries to countries that are not so friendly to us or friendly to Russia, and bingo, the sanction is defeated. So he's a smart guy, and using Belarus is a perfect example, sort of like your example of Cuba and Venezuela. Because Belarus, with Lukashenko, is really owned by Putin. We saw that recently with the Wagner Group over the weekend. So, query which are the ones that really count and which are the ones that don't count.
Well, I think they all count and they all have meaning. Certainly, the oil and gas side for Russia, the intent was to reduce the main source of Russian income, and that was very successful for quite a while. It is today. They sell less oil and gas today than they would have been selling without the sanctions. They get a lower price for it. They therefore.
I remember also at the beginning of that, there was an issue about Putin requiring the payment for the oil and gas from countries like India, for example, to be in rubles, not in the American dollar. And he's trying to bypass the reserve currency issue, something we talked about on our last meeting, right?
Well, actually, if Russia had the U.S. dollars, that would be very useful around the world. It was really it was the ability of Russia to buy things that was their problem. the sanctions, if you don't have normal flow of dollars into Russia for the oil and gas, then the way they paid for all of their imports, had to change. And that, use of the capital flow sanctions also, affects that same idea. So that, the sanctions were very disruptive for Russia, but Russia, is a large populous country. They've got a lot of well-educated people, and that they have an easier way to get around a few sanctions. The sanctions against them are nothing compared to what the U.S. did to either Cuba or Venezuela.
Well, we have the problem of not being, you mentioned that the United States could say to a given country, look, we'd like you to respect our sanctions against Russia and do the same thing. And they may not do that. Our closest allies will do that, but some countries in the middle won't do that. So we don't have 100% cooperation around the world. For example, Russia has a lot of influence in Africa through the Wagner Group, by the way. And in fact, not to get too far off the point, but there was a further sanction today about diamonds, a sanction against Russian diamonds, because the Russians get diamonds from Africa, historically through the Wagner Group, and they polish them in the West somewhere, and they're sold off as diamonds that were sold by the polishers, not by Russia. Anyway,
So
that's just a recent sanction. Right now, the sanctions are continuing. Is my point.
yes, but where you used other countries in cooperation and lack thereof, one of the interesting things about sanctions is how the United Nations reacts to sanctions. For example, for the last 30 years at least, every single year there's been a resolution of the General Assembly that the U.S. should eliminate the sanctions against Cuba. They should cease and desist. And virtually all the countries in the world support that.
So those countries who voted, to support Cuba, are not going to cooperate. And it's futile for the United States to say to country X, look, if you don't cooperate, we're going to sanction you. And so it's really a question of diplomacy at the end of the day. If we can't get only a handful of countries, our closest allies, to join in the sanctions are not nearly as compelling as they might have been.
That's correct. The the U.S. certainly has a phenomenal amount of control over most of the major corporations in the world, because there's virtually no major corporations that exist that don't have trade or financial transactions that utilize the U.S. or the U.S. capital markets. So that the U.S. has a lot of leverage. It's simply what's the purpose of a sanction, and is it successful? Well, if you look at the Russian sanction, the run-of-the-mill resident of Leningrad or Rostov or Moscow, they really don't see much effect of the sanctions. That whereas you wait a while, and if the sanctions are as strong relative to the muscle of the country, like the ones against, Venezuela or Cuba, they're successful. Where the ones against North Korea and Iran, were just not very successful. You get, the U.S. sanctioning Iran, plays a major role in my opinion, as to why Iran is supporting the Russian effort against Ukraine.
Oh, sure. And Syria, the same. Syria is also supporting the Russian effort against Ukraine, and there are other countries, and obviously they're not going to support American sanctions. But I see two axes on the chart here. One is over time, um, the sanctions that we put together can be bypassed by Russia. They are being bypassed by Russia, and and that's one you know point on the chart. The other point on the chart, and I'd like to ask you about this, is that these sanctions may not have immediate effect. Some of these economic sanctions, banking sanctions, import-export sanctions, and the like, they may not have immediate effect, and the people in St. Petersburg may not feel it. After all, it's only been a year. It's only been a year. But what about 2 years and 3 years and 4 years? Aren't they going to erode the Russian economy big time after a while? Doesn't it have a deteriorating effect? By the way, I read a report that said that Russia's actual economy is increasing, depending on who you talk to, between 1 and 2.5% this past year. That's extraordinary. I wouldn't have expected that with the sanctions. But over time, don't you think the sanctions will have greater effect?
Well, when you act surprised with an increase in economic activity, if you think of World War II, you know, the war effort basically brought most of the world out of the Great Depression.
Yeah, that's
Like,
true. That's true.
so I was trying to use that as my way of describing economic activity in Russia connected to the war in Ukraine, has an economic plus side. If you're talking about, are there jobs, and is the economy doing something? Well, but they're not necessarily feeding, the people, or upping their standard of living as much as, they're just providing bullets that they're shooting into Ukraine.
Well, there
Uh,
was a piece in the paper, Ken, just a few days ago about this new wave of money that has come into the Russian community. Um, People have been getting death benefits for the loss of their sons and daughters who are in the war, and finally the Russian government has gotten around to pay them off, and this leaves the consumer economy awash in cash.
well,
I wonder if this helps the economy.
you've got to. I think that's an exaggeration, because you think of, there's 140 million population in Russia, and so you can kill a couple hundred thousand troops, and that doesn't really add an awful lot in benefit. Like, it's not too big compared to the population. I mean, key in their whole effort to use the Wagner group was to not have, the Russian public so aware of the war effort and how many people were put in harm's way. Um,
Well, in a kind of naive way of looking at it, it seems to me that if the sanctions had effect, it would ultimately reach the public in Russia, and they would say, "Oh, something's wrong here. We're not doing very well in this war, and we're a pariah around the world. And Europe is really calling us names and calling us out and questioning our motives and all that." But has that happened? Of course, the what do you call it? The insurrection last weekend suggests that finally the Russian people may begin to understand that there's a problem, and that the war may not be justified according to Prigozhin. Um, but I'm not sure up to this point, they have understood that. And I'm not sure that up to this point, the sanctions have had them, reconsider their position. They see all this propaganda on the television and they buy it, and the sanctions don't change their mind. Do you think that's going to change?
um, well, I look at that problem differently than the way you described it. I think of sanctions against a country has to be looked at from two different perspectives. you know, what about the public? Like the average person in Russia or in Venezuela, you know, their sanctions are there, and do they even know they've been sanctioned? There's certainly no short-term effect. But the other side of it is the purpose of sanctions are usually to coerce the government into doing something different. And most US sanctions, have almost like an underlying purpose to cause regime change, to cause a change of government, to cause a change of attitude. I mean, if you use the most blatant example is the Cuban one. I mean, the US even went to great lengths of the Bay of Pigs mess. It is, and, has, you know, 60 years of sanctions caused a change in the Cuban government? No, no.
Well,
It,
Castro died.
yeah, and his brothers resigned, kind of thing. But so it's still, the old communist state, or those that were in power stay there. The public really didn't get a chance to even vote whether they'd like to have a different regime or not.
Well, let me ask you this. It's just it's kind of a speculative issue, but suppose regime change did change. I mean, suppose we had a regime change. I mean, and for a little while over the weekend, it was suggested we might have a regime change in Russia because of Prigozhin. Um, and so, what interests me is the possibility that if he had succeeded, if there was a regime change, if Prigozhin had gotten all the way to Moscow and Putin, left town completely, went to, for example, Belarus with his friend, would the sanctions have a greater effect, a lesser effect, or would it be good advice, foreign policy advice for the government, for the U.S. government, to pull the sanction?
Well, I tend to think, like, when you think of sanctions and the fact that they're partially successful, but they're not really that successful, it's a pretty blunt instrument. Now, when you got a little wee country, like relative to the US, like either the, Venezuela or Cuba are examples where the sanctions were extremely successful in accomplishing horrific economic damage to the country. But, the purpose was to cause the government to do something different, and it didn't. It was simply the public suffering. Where you get another small country like North Korea, or Syria, and the sanctions had no effect at all. Now part of that is because, Syria and North Korea had powerful friends who helped them get around the sanctions. Certainly Iran has not gone backwards in any way, shape, or form because of sanctions against them. And North Korea, the public suffered lots, but the government hasn't done diddly squat to as a result of the sanctions.
Well, we always have to remember that the sanctions are a kind of proxy for a kinetic war. I mean, the alternative years ago wouldn't be sanctions; it would be send the boys in, let's bomb the hell out of them, that sort of thing. So I guess in a larger sense, it's better to try the sanctions than send the troops in. On the other hand, though, it seems to me that if you're going to do sanctions, you have to tune them. It's like what we did with China. With I guess it was Trump, where he laid a tariff on them and all that, or multiple tariffs that ultimately wound up costing American farmers a lot of money. Um, I wonder if sanctions should always be negotiated and tuned up. If you're good today, we're going to release them a little bit. If you're bad, we're going to increase them. Leaving yourself plenty of room to reflect changes in this attitude problem that this country may have. But I don't see us doing that. I don't see us reflecting, what is going on in changing the tariffs or releasing them.
Well, that comes to the very idea of how can you improve the effectiveness of sanctions, or what could be done differently. And I think of the sanctions the way the US is using them is like a big stick. They're just bashing some little country or trying to bash a big country like Russia. However, um, certainly in the case that I know best, the Cuban one, I would think of the U.S. ought to have, you know, a carrot and a stick. You need to have the carrot side. You need to have. We would like to encourage you to do something different, not simply we wish to coerce you and beat you to death if you don't. Like you know, countries are entitled to have a different opinion. Um, the U.S. Is less democratic than a lot of countries, and from a point of view of a Canadian, one would say some of the activities in Florida and Texas nowadays would deserve international sanctions. But
Well, that's
you know,
another issue. But
yeah,
let me just say that what that in the future, maybe we have to learn more about how to impose them and do the carrot stick thing, and like in there's this biblical notion of camels bearing gifts. You don't put all your gifts on one camel. You have a parade of camels, and they come one at a time, and they have each have a certain amount of gifts. The same thing with sanctions. It should be camels bearing sanctions, and there's a little here, there's a little there, and they come in a parade. And if you don't want to respect the first camel, maybe the second one will be respected. And so the same here. We just went in there, slash and burn, put every single sanction we could think of, and then he could work against that. But if we keep on doing it and keep on advancing it for every month that he continues the war, then maybe we have a better chance at stopping him, because the implication is, oh my goodness, the United States is going to keep on increasing the sanctions every month. We better reconsider. The other thing I wanted to pose to you is that we should have learned, and that means Joe Biden should have, and his administration should have learned how to do sanctions better in general. And have we? And how do you think sanctions will function in the future with those lessons?
well, certainly the U.S. Congress is more prone to add sanctions more easily than they have in the past. But they have lots of experience with a bunch of them. They never seem to take them off the books.
Hmm.
That's one of the key problems. That's where I think of the carrot, as long to go along with the stick, that really makes it better. But it really is a difficult problem, because you're trying to affect an economy where you think of what affects an economy the most over time, and the most successful economies are the ones that grow, are ones that foster a lot of trade, a lot of transaction, and your whole gist of most sanctions is to disrupt the trade in the short run for a country, and to hopefully cause those in charge to say, "Gee, we should adjust." But most of the time, there's a regime change attitude that really causes it to work backwards. That is, why did Russia immediately negotiate with China and India and Pakistan and such? We'll have new pipelines, and will you buy some extra oil in the meantime, etc. Um, it's trying to get so that you're affecting the government more so with the sanctions rather than just the public over a long period of time.
Ken, this whole conversation suggests to me that the one huge overriding danger of the sanctions methodology that the administration has implemented is to divide the world. And that's the net effect of the sanctions and then the counter sanctions, the counter maneuvers by Putin. Because you have certain countries on the one side of the coin, now certain countries on the other side of the coin. They're building bridges and relationships between themselves. And now you really have a very defined, a defined separation of, call it West and East, but it's pro-Russian and anti-Russian. And I'm not sure that this is really a global public foreign relations question, a geopolitical question. But I'm not sure that's good for us to have the world divided that way. I think on balance, we may have lost some friends.
Well, that I agree with that whole concept exactly. I mean, if you think of the sanctions against Iran, what it resulted in is for them to dig in their heels, because really the push was for regime change. Fine, the nuclear bomb threat was the excuse, let's call it. But really, the main push from the U.S. and others in a lot of ways was, regime change rather than or change in attitude of the government. Where Iran, is more people, about the same number of people as Germany, and their next door neighbor Pakistan, or almost next door, has atomic capabilities. So does Israel, even though they pretend they don't. And so, Iran may think it's in their best interest that they need to have, a balance of military power. But really, if you push the sanctions, you're simply forcing a country to move away, as long as they feel that you're trying to push their leadership in a direction their leadership doesn't want to go. They don't like being coerced.
Yeah,
So
even our allies,
they're gonna resist it.
even our former allies. I'm assuming that Canada will always be with us, Ken. But perhaps Canada may come to a point where it doesn't agree with bad policy. What do you think?
Well, Canada doesn't agree with a lot of American policies, but you kind of have, so what? We got to live with it. Um, like what the UK, when the United Kingdom decided to vote for Brexit, you'd say, do you agree or disagree? But you have, so it's really is our business. We have an interest in it, but we don't get to decide. So
Okay.
whether that's brilliant or stupid on their part, and its effect on us, we don't get a vote.
It's an underwriting issue of our whole series somehow. Anyway, Ken Rogers, thank you so much for joining us on this. I think this has been very instructive to figure out, exactly what's happening, and what could happen, what will happen, and how the world is changing around that.
It's such a complex subject. Like, it's really almost impossible to evaluate how effective, each and every policy with regard to sanctions has been, and how do you amend it to make it better. But at least the effort's worth trying.
Yep. And how each of these elements, these components, interact with each other, and how they build up toward a more powerful collective sanction. Anyway, we're out of time, Ken. Thank you so much. We'll circle back. We'll have more. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please click on the like and subscribe buttons on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And please check out our website. That's thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.